The mist rolled thick over the Montana Valley, swallowing the moonlight and casting ghostly shadows through the dense pines surrounding Emma Carter's training facility. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles, a scent that might have been comforting under normal circumstances. But tonight wasn't normal. Emma stood motionless on the wooden porch of her cabin, her sharp blue eyes scanning the darkness. Her breath was steady, measured. She wasn't afraid fear had been trained out of her long ago. Instead, she was calculating, analyzing the subtle changes in her environment. Her dogs knew first. Shadow and Ghost, her two Belgian Malinois, had been lounging in their usual spots near the training yard when they suddenly stiffened. Their ears twitched, nostrils flaring as they caught a scent Emma hadn't yet detected. Their movements were silent, trained to avoid giving away their presence. They were reading the night, responding to something unseen. Emma didn't need them to bark. She trusted their instincts more than any security system. Someone was here. She adjusted the grip on her knife, concealed against her forearm beneath her jacket. A firearm was holstered at her hip, but bullets made noise, knives didn't. If they were watching her, she wouldn't give them any sound to track. A faint rustle in the underbrush confirmed what her dogs already knew. Emma's pulse remained steady, her mind clicking through possibilities. Trespassers? Hunters straying too close? Or something worse? She gave a subtle hand signal, and the dogs melted into the shadows, moving with ghost-like precision along the perimeter of the property. If someone was here to test her defenses, they were about to get their answer. Another sound closer this time. A misplaced footstep against damp leaves. Emma moved down from the porch, boots silent against the ground. Her heart wasn't racing. This was familiar territory. The calm before the engagement. Then, a faint glint of metal through the trees. A scoped rifle. Emma exhaled slowly, masking the flicker of adrenaline in her bloodstream. They weren't amateurs. Whoever was out there was watching her, and they had come prepared. She crouched low, pressing herself against the wooden exterior of the training facility, her movements synchronized with the dog's silent, controlled, unseen. Ghost reappeared at her side, his presence a whisper against her leg. The signal was clear. 3 intruders, moving separately, coordinated. Emma's mind worked quickly. 3 meant it wasn't just lost travelers or reckless hunters. 3 meant tactics. 3 meant planning. And planning meant intent. The faint hum of a suppressed radio transmission crackled through the night air. A voice, low and distant, relaying information. She caught a name. Jackson. Her lips barely moved as she whispered a command to Ghost. The dog slipped away into the night, his mission clear. Shadow had already flanked around to their blind spot, waiting for her signal. Emma slowly withdrew a throwing knife from her sleeve, feeling the cold steel against her fingertips. If they thought she was an easy target, they were about to learn a very painful lesson. The hunters had come to stalk her land. They didn't realize they were the ones being hunted. The night thickened, wrapping the training facility in an eerie stillness. Emma remained motionless, pressed against the wooden exterior of her cabin, her breath controlled, measured. The game had begun. Ghost had already vanished into the tree line, his training allowing him to move like a phantom through the underbrush. Shadow remained in position, waiting for Emma's next command. They weren't just dogs, they were weapons. The radio static crackled again. "Jackson, we got movement. Something's tracking us." A moment of silence. Then a response, controlled, sharp. "Stay in formation. She's not alone." Emma almost smirked. They were already on edge. Good. She could hear their footfalls, now soft, calculated. Whoever they were, they knew how to move quietly, but not quiet enough. The damp earth betrayed them, the occasional misstep kicking up a faint shuffle of leaves. Then a metallic click. A weapon being readied. Emma's muscles coiled. These weren't just trespassers. They had come expecting trouble. She moved, gliding through the shadows along the perimeter of the cabin, keeping low. The rifleman was still perched in the trees, barely visible, scanning her property through his scope. He was hunting. But he had made a mistake. He was too focused on his target, unaware that the real threats weren't standing in the open, but moving in the darkness around him. A soft thump. A muffled grunt. Emma's heart remained steady. Ghost had struck first. Through the shadows, she glimpsed a figure collapsing into the underbrush, the sharp snap of a wrist breaking as Ghost took the man down. There was no barking, no struggle, just the wet gasp of air leaving the intruder's lungs as the dog's weight pinned him. Emma turned her attention back to the rifleman. He had heard the noise. His body stiffened, adjusting his aim. His breath quickened, visible in the cold night air. Emma gripped the hilt of her throwing knife. One shot. One movement. No second chances. The rifleman shifted, scanning left-wrong move. Emma struck. The knife sliced through the air in absolute silence, embedding itself deep into the man's shoulder. He let out a strangled cry, dropping his weapon, hands flailing to claw at the blade now buried in his flesh. Too slow. Emma was already there, closing the distance before he could react. A hard strike to his throat cut off his scream, and in the next breath, she dropped him to the ground with brutal efficiency. 2 down. 1 left. The final intruder realized too late that he was alone. Emma heard him breathing. Panicked. Ragged. He was backing away, retreating toward the tree line, trying to radio for backup. But backup wasn't coming. Shadow had already flanked behind him. The moment his foot hit the clearing, the dog sprang a blur of muscle and fangs. A single sharp yelp of surprise was all the man managed before he was on the ground, screaming. Emma approached, slow and controlled, as the man writhed beneath Shadow's crushing grip. His weapon had been knocked aside, useless. She crouched, her face calm as she pressed a boot to his chest. "You've got one chance to talk," she said, voice dangerously quiet. "Or you leave here in pieces." The man choked, his panicked gaze flicking between the snarling dog at his throat and the woman above him. He knew, in that moment, he had chosen the wrong target. Emma leaned closer, her voice like a blade in the cold air. "Who sent you?" The man struggled beneath her boot, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His hands trembled, raised in surrender as Shadow's snarling jaws hovered inches from his throat. Emma could see the terror in his eyes, the stark realization that he was utterly at her mercy. "Good." She leaned in slightly, applying more pressure to his chest. "Who sent you?" Her voice was low, controlled, like the quiet before a storm. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the darkness where his fallen comrades lay. His lips parted, but no words came. Still resisting. Emma sighed. She didn't have time for games. She gave a simple hand signal. Shadow tightened his grip, fangs sinking just enough into the man's jacket to pierce the skin beneath. Not a killing blow, just a promise. The man let out a strangled cry. "Jackson!" He gasped. "Jackson Hill sent us." Emma's expression remained unreadable, though the name sent a sharp jolt of recognition through her mind. Jackson Hill. The name had been whispered around town, attached to rumors of a new outlaw crew moving into the area. Emma had never crossed paths with him directly, but she knew his type. Ex-military, high-level enforcer, the kind of man who commanded loyalty through fear. And now, he had sent men to test her. "Why?" she pressed. The man hesitated until Shadow growled, deep and guttural. He wants your land," the intruder stammered. "Says it's prime territory." "Strategic." Emma's jaw tightened. "Strategic for what?" The man continued, words spilling out in desperation. He knows what you used to be. Said you were a soldier. Said you weren't just training pets out here. ****. Emma's pulse remained steady, but inside, something clicked into place. They knew about her past. Jackson wasn't just interested in taking over some rural training facility. He had done his homework. He knew who she was, what she had been. And if he was after her land, it wasn't for dog training. He wanted it for something else. Emma exhaled slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. Smuggling? Weapons storage? A stronghold for his expanding operations? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. This wouldn't end with just a warning. She studied the man beneath her. He was trembling now, his face pale with the weight of realization. He understood the mistake he had made. Emma's fingers switched slightly, debating the next move. Let him go and risk him running back to Jackson? Or end this here? Before she could decide, the faint whine of an approaching engine cut through the silence. A vehicle. Moving fast. Emma's head snapped up, her senses sharpening. It was coming from the West Road, one of the only routes leading to her property. Not good. Shadow released the man instantly at Emma's subtle signal, backing away as she rose to her feet. Ghost reappeared at her side, his ears pinned forward, tracking the sound. The vehicle was getting closer. Emma moved quickly. She yanked the man to his feet and shoved him toward the tree line. Run! The man didn't hesitate. He bolted into the darkness, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. She wasn't worried. He wouldn't be coming back. Emma turned, already in motion. She needed cover before whoever was coming got here. She signaled the dogs, and they fell in beside her as she melted into the shadows of the facility's outer perimeter. The vehicle roared into view, a black SUV, headlights cutting through the mist. It didn't slow down. Emma's muscles tensed. This wasn't a search party. This was an assault. The SUV skidded to a stop, tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The doors flew open, and figures spilled out. 4 men, moving fast, weapons drawn, reinforcements. Emma's heart remained steady, her mind already calculating. Jackson had just made a big mistake. The black SUV idled just beyond the clearing, its engine humming low like a predator waiting to strike. Emma watched from her hidden vantage point, her pulse steady despite the rapid escalation. 4 men. Armed. Moving in formation. Jackson hadn't sent another scouting party this time. This was a message. Emma signaled Ghost and Shadow, and both dogs slinked into the underbrush, circling wide to flank the newcomers. She remained in the darkness, studying the men's movements. The first 2 emerged quickly, one holding a sawed-off shotgun, the other gripping a semi-automatic pistol. The third moved more cautiously, scanning the area like he expected trouble. The 4th man stayed by the SUV. Emma narrowed her eyes. He was different, taller, heavier built, carrying himself with the authority of someone used to command. And when he finally stepped into the moonlight, she recognized him. Jackson Hill. He wasn't hiding anymore. This was personal. Jackson tilted his head, scanning the facility's perimeter, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Emma Carter," he called out, voice carrying over the cool night air. "We need to talk." Emma remained silent. She wasn't about to step into the open on his terms. Jackson sighed, feigning disappointment. "You took out my men," he continued. "That's not good business, sweetheart. Makes me look weak." Emma could hear the smirk in his voice. A test. He was gauging her reaction. She didn't take the bait. Jackson kept talking. "Here's the deal. You've got something I want. A nice piece of land. Strategic location. Perfect for future plans. ****, his tone darkened. "You can either work with me, or you can disappear." A simple ultimatum. But Jackson had underestimated her. Emma exhaled slowly, her mind already mapping out the next move. Shadow. The silent command sent the dog slipping further around the clearing, positioning himself behind the intruders. Ghost mirrored the movement on the opposite side. They were surrounded, and they didn't even know it yet. Jackson took a step forward. No answer? He sighed. Shame. I was hoping we could be civil about this. He nodded toward his men. Find her. Emma shifted her weight, adjusting her stance. It was time. She stepped forward, just enough for the moonlight to catch the glint of her blade. I'm right here, Jackson. Jackson's lips curled into a slow smirk as Emma stepped into the moonlight, her posture loose but her eyes razor-sharp. His men tensed, their fingers hovering near their triggers, but Jackson raised a hand, signaling them to hold. There she is, he said smoothly. I was beginning to think you were scared. Emma didn't take the bait. She rolled her shoulders slightly, shifting her stance, her knife glinting faintly in her grip. You made a mistake coming here, Jackson. Her voice was calm, measured, but Jackson's smirk widened. Oh? Enlighten me. Emma tilted her head slightly, her gaze flicking toward the tree line for a fraction of a second. Just enough. Jackson followed the movement instinctively, his attention momentarily shifting. That's when Ghost struck. A blur of muscle and fur lunged from the shadows, hitting one of Jackson's men with the force of a wrecking ball. The man barely had time to scream before Ghost's jaws clamped down on his forearm, teeth sinking deep into flesh. He collapsed, gun tumbling from his grasp as he struggled against the sheer power pinning him down. The clearing erupted. Jackson's men scrambled, their discipline breaking for a crucial second. That was all Emma needed. She moved lightning fast, closing the distance to the next closest target. The man fumbled with his weapon, but she was already there. Her knife flashed, slicing across his forearm. He howled, dropping the gun as Emma twisted, elbow driving into his ribs with a sickening crunch. He crumpled, gasping for breath. A shotgun boomed, the blast tearing through the night air. Emma dropped low, feeling the heat of the shot ripping past her shoulder. She rolled, snatching up the fallen pistol and snapping her aim toward the shooter. Too slow. Shadow took him down first. The dog hit like a hammer, knocking the man off balance. His shotgun discharged wildly into the sky as Shadow's teeth clamped around his leg, dragging him down. That left Jackson. He hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched. Instead, he watched. Studied. His men were writhing on the ground, weapons useless, pinned beneath trained killing machines. Emma rose to her feet, leveling the pistol at him. That's twice now you've underestimated me, she said coolly. Jackson exhaled slowly, then he smiled. Damn. They were right about you. His tone was almost admiring. You're good, Carter. Real good. He lifted his hand slightly, a mock gesture of surrender. But you know this isn't over. Emma's grip tightened on the pistol, but she didn't fire. Not yet. Jackson wasn't a common thug he was calculating. He'd walked into this expecting to intimidate her, and instead, he'd just gotten a first-hand lesson in why that was a bad idea. But he wasn't panicked. That meant he had another play. Before she could respond, the radio on Jackson's hip crackled. A sharp, urgent voice. Boss, we got company. Cops are moving in fast. Jackson's jaw tensed. His eyes flicked toward the road. Emma didn't turn to look, she already knew. Sheriff Cooper had been monitoring the situation, waiting for a reason to intervene. And now he had one. The roar of approaching engines filled the air, headlights cutting through the trees. Jackson let out a low chuckle. Looks like you get a temporary win. Then, before Emma could react, he threw down a smoke grenade. Thick white fog exploded between them, blinding her vision. By the time it cleared, Jackson and his remaining men were gone. Emma exhaled sharply, heart still pounding as the sheriff's cruiser screeched to a stop. Jackson had escaped. But now this was a war. Emma stood still, gripping the pistol tightly as the last wisps of smoke dissipated. Sheriff Cooper stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunching against the gravel. His gaze swept over the fallen men groaning in the dirt, then shifted to Emma, his expression unreadable. "Hell of a mess you've got here," he muttered. Emma finally lowered her weapon, exhaling slowly. They started it. Cooper gave a slow nod, scanning the scene before kneeling beside one of Jackson's injured men. "You're lucky we showed up when we did. If Jackson had more time, this could have ended differently." Emma didn't respond. She knew he was right. Ghost and Shadow stood alert beside her, their bodies coiled, ready for another fight. The sheriff studied the two dogs, shaking his head slightly. Never seen animals fight like that. That's military work. He rose to his feet, fixing Emma with a knowing look. And Jackson Hill isn't just some biker running protection rackets. He's ex-military too. Emma's eyes narrowed. "You know him?" Cooper sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Not personally, but I know his type. Jackson was Force Recon. Did Black Ops overseas. Then one day he disappears. Turns up years later, running his own little empire of mercenaries, smugglers and traffickers." His voice darkened. The kind of guy who doesn't take no for an answer. Emma already knew that. She didn't need Cooper to tell her Jackson was dangerous. She had seen it firsthand. The way he moved, the way he assessed the battlefield, how he didn't panic even when things went sideways. He had experience, and that made him a much bigger problem than some low-level thug. "He's after my land," Emma said. "But he's not just looking to expand. He knows my past. He's got intel on me." Cooper's expression hardened. "Then he's been planning this for a while." The weight of those words settled between them. This wasn't just some territorial dispute. Jackson had specifically targeted her, and that meant he knew more than he should. Emma's mind raced through the possibilities. Had someone from her past leaked information? Or was Jackson just that well connected? Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was stopping him. One of the injured men groaned, shifting slightly in the dirt. Cooper crouched down, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him upright. "Who else is coming?" The man spat blood, glaring up at the sheriff. "You think I'm scared of you?" Cooper sighed, then whistled sharply. Ghost moved instantly, closing the gap between them in a flash. The biker flinched hard, eyes going wide as the dog's powerful frame loomed over him, sharp teeth inches from his throat. Cooper didn't even blink. "Want to rethink that?" The man's breath hitched. He looked at Emma, then back at Cooper. Then finally he cracked. "Jackson's got more coming," he muttered. "Not just bikers. He's bringing in people from out of state. Guys like him. Ex-military, ex-contractors. Real hitters." Emma's stomach tightened. That meant Jackson wasn't just retaliating, he was escalating. He wasn't done with her. Not even close. Cooper let go of the man's collar, letting him slump back onto the ground. "You need to be ready, Carter," he said, voice grim. "Because next time, he won't just send a warning." Emma knew that. She had been in too many fights to think Jackson would just walk away. But she wasn't scared. She was ready. Emma stood in the aftermath, her mind already working through the next steps. Jackson wasn't backing down. He was regrouping, bringing in professionals, and that meant the real fight was still ahead. Sheriff Cooper knew it too. He motioned for his deputies to cuff the surviving bikers, then turned to her. "You got a plan?" Emma exhaled slowly, glancing toward the dark tree line where Jackson had disappeared. "Yeah. I'm not waiting for him to make the next move." Cooper studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're not planning on taking him head-on, are you?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I plan on finishing this before he gets the chance." Cooper let out a long breath. "I should tell you to stand down. Let the law handle it." He glanced at the unconscious men his deputies were hauling to their feet. "But we both know this is beyond legal channels now." Emma nodded. Jackson wouldn't be stopped by warrants or arrests. He operated outside the system, and the only way to beat him was to outmaneuver him. She turned to Shadow and Ghost, giving a quick signal. The dogs immediately moved toward the tree line, scanning the perimeter for any lingering threats. She needed to secure her land, reinforce her defenses, and most importantly figure out exactly what Jackson wanted with her property. He had said it was strategic, but for what? "You need backup?" Cooper asked, watching as she checked her sidearm. Emma shook her head. "I've got it covered." He didn't argue, but his expression darkened. "Be careful, Carter. Jackson plays for keeps." She didn't need the warning. She already knew. As the sheriff and his deputies left, taking the captured bikers with them, Emma moved quickly. She had work to do. First, she secured the facility, ensuring every motion sensor and camera was active. Then she disappeared into the night, moving through the trees with practiced ease, Shadow and Ghost flanking her like silent sentinels. She knew where she needed to go. Jackson had a safe house outside town. It wasn't widely known, but Emma had spent years learning how to track men like him. She had pieced it together from whispers, small clues, an abandoned hunting cabin that suddenly had power running to it, vehicles spotted there at odd hours. Jackson thought he was careful. He wasn't careful enough. It took her less than an hour to reach the outskirts of the property. She crouched low, peering through her scope. 3 men outside, armed, rotating patrols. The place was fortified, but not impenetrable. Jackson wasn't there. If he was, security would be tighter. That meant she had time. Time to slip inside, find intel, and get out before they even knew she was there. Emma gave a silent hand signal, and Ghost slinked forward, moving low and fast. Shadow took the opposite side, positioning himself near the patrol route. Emma stayed in the cover of the trees, waiting for the perfect moment. The first guard stopped, lighting a cigarette. A mistake. The second turned away for just a second. Another mistake. Emma moved. She was a shadow in the night, a blur of controlled motion. The first guard barely had time to register her presence before her knife found his throat. No sound, no struggle. She caught him as he fell, lowering him silently into the grass. 1 down. 2 to go. Emma didn't stop. She moved with precision, her body low, every step calculated. The second guard was just a few feet away, oblivious to the body cooling in the grass behind him. She could hear the faint hum of his radio, the static blending with the sounds of the forest. He wasn't expecting an attack. He thought he was in control. That made him easy prey. Emma struck fast, her arm wrapped around his throat, cutting off his air before he could react. He struggled, hands clawing at her grip, but she held firm. His body jerked violently, then weakened. A few more seconds, and he went limp. She eased him to the ground, scanning the perimeter. 1 left. The last guard was at the far end of the cabin, standing near the back porch, his rifle resting casually against his shoulder. He was watching the tree line but not really seeing. His posture was too relaxed, his mind somewhere else. He didn't expect anything to happen. Emma would make sure he didn't get the chance to regret that mistake. She reached for her belt, pulling a small, weighted knife from its sheath. The distance was just over 15 feet, an easy throw. She steadied her aim, exhaled slowly, and released. The blade cut through the air, silent and deadly. It hit its mark, sinking into the man's throat. His eyes widened in shock, hands flying up to the handle as he staggered backward. Blood gurgled from his lips as he collapsed against the wall of the cabin. Emma didn't waste time. She moved to the door, pressing her back against the wooden frame. She listened, no movement inside. The place was quiet. Too quiet. She tested the handle. Unlocked. Another mistake. Jackson had trained his men well for combat, but he hadn't taught them how to expect someone like her. She slipped inside. The interior smelled of cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey. Papers were scattered across a wooden table, maps pinned to the walls. She moved quickly, scanning the documents. Routes, supply chains, transport schedules. Jackson wasn't just running a gang, he was coordinating something bigger. Then she saw it. A blueprint. Her land. Marked with red ink, key locations circled. Supply drop points. A planned airstrip. Everything clicked. Jackson wasn't after her land just to expand, he needed it for smuggling. The location was perfect, isolated with multiple access points through the mountains. He was setting up an operation that went beyond weapons or drugs. This was infrastructure. A long-term play. Footsteps. Emma froze, her hand instinctively going to her pistol. Someone was outside. A vehicle door slammed. Voices low, muffled. More men were arriving. She had what she needed. Time to go. Emma backed toward the door, moving fast but controlled. Ghost was already waiting outside, his body tense, ears pricked forward. Shadow lingered near the tree line, watching. Emma gave a silent signal, and they vanished into the night. By the time Jackson stepped inside, she was already gone. Emma moved like a ghost through the trees, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Ghost and Shadow flanked her, their bodies tense, ears flicking at every distant sound. She had what she needed, proof. Jackson wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was building something bigger, something that would turn her land into a key hub for smuggling. That wasn't going to happen. She reached the edge of her property just before dawn, slipping through the hidden paths she had memorized over years of training. The facility was quiet, untouched. But she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Jackson would come. And this time, he wouldn't just send scouts. He'd bring an army. Inside, she secured the documents she had stolen, locking them in a hidden safe beneath the floorboards. Then she grabbed her phone, dialing a secure number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Carter." Emma exhaled. "I need backup." A pause. Then a slow, knowing sigh. "How bad?" "Bad." Another pause. Then, "I'm on my way." She hung up. Help was coming. But would it be enough? She turned to the dogs, running a hand over Shadow's head. "We don't have much time." They needed to fortify the facility, set up defenses, and most importantly, be ready for whatever Jackson had planned. She had fought in wars before. Now, she was about to start another one. Jackson was furious. The cabin was a mess. Papers scattered. Blood still pooled on the back porch where one of his men had collapsed. His safe house had been compromised. His plans were in the wind. Jackson paced, his hands clenched into fists. His remaining men stood around him, shifting uncomfortably, waiting for orders. One of them finally spoke. "Boss, it had to be her. She hit us. Took everything." Jackson let out a slow breath. "Yeah, I know." He had underestimated her. A mistake he wouldn't make again. He turned to his second-in-command, a thick-set man named Rourke. "Get everyone. We end this tonight." The sun was barely over the horizon when Emma heard the first drone. She looked up, spotting the tiny silhouette against the sky. It hovered, scanning, watching. Jackson was scouting her. She clenched her jaw, adrenaline surging. He was coming. She grabbed her rifle and moved to the control room, activating the security feeds. Cameras hidden around the property flickered to life, showing the surrounding roads and tree lines. Nothing yet. But she knew that wouldn't last. Then movement. Far off, beyond the perimeter, a dust cloud rising. Engines. They were on their way. Emma's grip tightened on the rifle. Let them come. She was ready. The distant roar of engines grew louder, a low, menacing hum that vibrated through the morning air. Emma kept her breathing steady, her pulse slow despite the storm brewing on the horizon. She had been in situations like this before. The waiting was always the hardest part. But soon, there would be no more waiting. Only action. Through the security feeds, she counted at least 10 bikes, a black SUV following close behind. Jackson wasn't holding back. He had brought the full force of his crew, ready to wipe her out. Emma adjusted her rifle's scope, tracking the vehicles as they approached the turnoff leading to her facility. The road leading in was narrow, winding, easy to control if you knew how. And she knew exactly how. She exhaled and pressed a button on the control panel. A mile down the road, a series of buried explosives detonated in sequence, sending a shockwave of dirt and debris into the air. The leading motorcycles swerved violently as the asphalt beneath them cracked apart, throwing 2 riders into the trees. The rest skidded to a halt, engines growling as the dust settled. Through her scope, Emma watched as Jackson's SUV jerked to a stop just short of the destruction. The driver cursed, slamming the steering wheel. Jackson stepped out slowly, surveying the damage. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. Then, to Emma's surprise, he laughed. A slow, quiet chuckle. Then he turned toward the trees and nodded. Emma's stomach tightened. He had planned for this. From the woods flanking the road, figures emerged. Not bikers. Trained operators. Their movements were disciplined, controlled. Jackson hadn't just brought gang members, he had brought professionals. Ex-military. Mercenaries. Emma cursed under her breath. He knew she'd set traps. And he had come prepared. She turned away from the screen and grabbed her gear. The fight wasn't going to stay at the perimeter. It was coming straight to her. Ghost and Shadow were already at her side, their bodies tense, muscles coiled. She knelt, running a hand down Ghost's back, grounding herself. "We hold the line," she murmured. The dog's ears flicked. He understood. Emma stood, chambered around, and moved toward the front entrance. The battle was about to begin. Emma took position behind the reinforced barricade near the training yard, rifle steady as she watched Jackson's men advance. The bikers stayed back, unsure, but the mercenaries moved with precision. They weren't just charging in. They were coordinating, covering angles, flanking. Jackson had brought professionals for a reason. He wasn't just here to scare her, he was here to end this. Through her scope, she tracked one of the mercenaries, a man with a tactical vest, suppressor on his rifle, highly trained. She adjusted her aim, exhaled slowly, and pulled the trigger. A single clean shot. His head snapped back, body crumpling before he could fire. The battle erupted. Gunfire exploded from the tree line as the mercenaries reacted, moving into cover. Jackson, standing near his SUV, barely flinched. He was watching, analyzing, waiting for his moment. He didn't want to waste his men. He wanted to draw Emma out. She wasn't going to give him the chance. "Shadow," she whispered. The dog moved instantly, sprinting low through the grass, circling around the right flank. Ghost followed seconds later, using the terrain to remain unseen. They had trained for this. They knew exactly what to do. Another mercenary broke from cover, trying to reposition. Emma took him down with a precise shot to the chest. The bikers behind Jackson hesitated. They weren't used to facing this kind of resistance. Good. Let them hesitate. Suddenly, a distant explosion rocked the ground. Emma's eyes flicked to the monitors. A second group of Jackson's men trying to breach from the rear. She pivoted, sprinting back toward the storage facility, rifle at the ready. As she moved, a shadow darted past her peripheral vision ghost, already closing in on the intruders. A sharp yell. A gunshot. Emma swung around the corner just in time to see one of the mercenaries on the ground, throat ripped open. Another aimed his weapon, but before he could fire, Shadow was on him. The fight was fast, brutal. Silent, Emma finished the third man herself. Breathing hard, she wiped the sweat from her brow, scanning the field. Jackson was still standing there, calm, waiting. He was letting his men bleed out, testing her, seeing how much she had left in her. She tightened her grip on the rifle. This was far from over. The battlefield was eerily silent. The last echoes of gunfire had faded into the distance, replaced by the crackling of burning debris and the faint, labored breathing of the wounded. Emma stood amidst the wreckage, her rifle still raised, her body tense. She wasn't convinced it was over. Jackson was gone. Somewhere in the chaos he had slipped away, leaving behind his dead and dying men. Typical operator mindset. When the mission fails, extract and reassess. But Emma knew he wasn't just running. He was regrouping. Ghost and Shadow moved through the bodies, their sharp eyes scanning for any remaining threats. They had fought well better than anyone expected. But even they seemed aware that this wasn't truly the end. A groan from nearby caught Emma's attention. One of the mercenaries, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the leg, tried to crawl toward a discarded pistol. Emma stepped forward and kicked the weapon away, leveling her own at his chest. "Where did Jackson go?" she demanded. The man coughed, spitting blood onto the dirt. "You think this is a victory?" He chuckled weakly. "You don't even know what's coming." Emma's grip tightened. "Try me." The mercenary smirked, his expression twisted in pain but filled with something else, certainty. "You were never the target, Carter," he rasped. "You were the test." Emma's pulse slowed. "Test for what?" He grinned, but his breath hitched, and then he was gone. The light faded from his eyes before he could say another word. Emma stepped back, her mind racing. Test. The word echoed in her head, a cold realization settling into her bones. Jackson hadn't just been after her land. Someone bigger had been watching. Someone who wanted to see how she would react, how far she would go. And now they had their answer. The wind howled through the trees as Emma stood over the fallen mercenary, his final words lingering in her mind. "You were the test." The weight of it settled deep in her chest. This hadn't been about territory or a smuggling operation. It had been a trial run. A way for someone or something bigger to gauge her skills, her defenses, her limits. Jackson had played his part, but he was never the endgame. He was just the opening move. She turned, scanning the battlefield. The bodies of Jackson's men lay scattered across the property. The sheriff would be here soon to clean up what was left, but it wouldn't matter. Jackson was still out there. And now, he wasn't just a threat, he was a loose end. Whoever had put him up to this wouldn't tolerate failure. They would come for him next. Ghost let out a low growl, ears pricked toward the tree line. Emma followed his gaze, muscles tensing. Something moved in the shadows. Not Jackson, he wouldn't be stupid enough to come back so soon. But someone was watching. Studying. Just like before. She raised her rifle, aiming toward the movement. But before she could fire, the figure melted away, disappearing into the darkness. No noise, no trace. A professional. Someone who had been there the entire time, observing the fight, gathering intel. Emma lowered her weapon, a slow exhale escaping her lips. The real enemy hadn't even stepped onto the battlefield yet. She turned back toward the facility, knowing what needed to be done. This wasn't over. It was just beginning.